On Christmas night, a lonely rancher found a mother and her baby in his barn. The wind outside howled through the small windows of the rancher's farmhouse. A thick blanket of snow covered the land, turning everything into a ghostly white. The rancher, a man in his 40s with weathered skin and rough hands, sat by the fire. His home was humble, no fancy decorations, no Christmas lights twinkling in the windows. It was just him, his ranch, and the quiet solitude that had become his companion over the years. Christmas had always been a quiet affair for him. There were no celebrations, no family gatherings, no laughter around the dinner table. It was just another day of tending to the animals, feeding the horses, and making sure everything on the ranch was in order. He had grown used to it, even if sometimes the silence felt heavier than usual. He had never been much for festivities. Life on the ranch was hard work, and after a long day's labor, there wasn't much energy left for anything else. The rancher had never married. There had been chances, but life had always gotten in the way. Now, the years had passed, and the chances for connection seemed farther away. He had made peace with it, but there were moments, like tonight, that the loneliness seemed to wrap itself around him like the cold wind outside. The snowstorm outside had started hours ago. It wasn't unusual for a storm to hit this time of year, but the rancher always felt uneasy when the weather turned harsh. He didn't mind the cold, it was part of life here, but the isolation, that was different. There was something about the deep, enveloping quiet that felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. As he stared into the fire, the flames crackling and popping in the stillness, he heard something. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first. The sound of something. Or someone. The rancher froze, straining his ears to listen. It came again, soft, like a cry. His heart skipped a beat. He stood up from his chair, the wooden floor creaking under his boots. The firelight cast shadows across the room as he made his way to the door. The wind outside screamed, but he could still hear it clearer now. A faint sound of distress. A baby. No, it couldn't be. He stepped into the cold air, his breath forming little clouds that disappeared into the darkness. The barn was about 50 yards away from the house, nestled in the far corner of the ranch. The rancher had always taken good care of it, making sure the animals were warm and safe. He often spent long hours there, mucking out the stalls and checking on the livestock. It was his domain, but tonight it felt different. The barn loomed in the distance, its outline barely visible through the thick, falling snow. He walked toward it, his boots crunching in the snow. As he neared the barn, he heard it again. The faint cry. It was definitely coming from inside. The rancher's stomach tightened. He reached for the barn door, which creaked open in protest, revealing the dim interior. The barn smelled of hay, wood, and the earthy scent of animals. But there was something else now, something unfamiliar. The rancher stepped inside, his boots echoing in the stillness. His eyes slowly adjusted to the low light, scanning the barn for any sign of movement. There, in the far corner, huddled under a stack of hay, was a woman. She looked young, her hair tangled and her clothes in tatters. She was holding a small bundle, a baby. The baby was wrapped in a thin blanket, its tiny face pale and sickly. The rancher stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. The woman looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at him, as if unsure whether to trust him or run. The rancher felt his heart race, but he didn't move. He could see how exhausted she was, how vulnerable. The baby in her arms barely moved, its face pinched with hunger or cold. "Are you all right?" the rancher asked, his voice soft, careful not to frighten her further. He wasn't used to talking to strangers, especially not like this. But something in his gut told him that this was a moment where he had to step up. The woman hesitated for a long time before she spoke, her voice weak and trembling. I didn't know where else to go. My car broke down hours ago. I was walking, but the snow, it's too cold. I thought the barn might offer some shelter." The rancher's heart sank as he looked at her. She was alone, with a sick baby and nowhere to turn. He had heard of people being stranded in the snow before, but to find someone in such a state in his barn. It felt wrong, but at the same time it felt like fate. "Come on," he said, his voice firm now. "You can't stay out here in this cold. Come inside, I'll take care of you." The woman looked at him, tears welling up in her eyes. She didn't speak, but he could see the gratitude in her face. Slowly she stood, her movements shaky. The baby in her arms barely stirred, its small chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The rancher stepped forward and gently helped her to her feet, careful not to startle her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I didn't know what I was going to do." The rancher nodded and wrapped his coat around her shoulders, leading her out of the barn and back toward the warmth of the house. The wind howled, biting at their skin, but the rancher didn't care. His mind was already racing with questions. Who was this woman? How had she ended up here so far from anyone? But there would be time for those questions later. For now, all that mattered was getting her inside, getting her and the baby warm. The storm outside was fierce, and the night was long. The rancher wasn't sure what he was getting himself into, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let her stay out there in the cold. The rancher led the woman inside his home, shutting the door behind them with a soft thud. The warmth of the house hit them immediately, the fire crackling in the hearth, sending flickering light across the room. It felt like a stark contrast to the cold, bitter wind outside. The rancher quickly pulled off his heavy coat and hung it by the door, then turned to the woman who was still shivering. "Sit down," he said gently, pointing to the chair near the fire. "You must be freezing." The woman nodded, her lips barely able to form a smile. She was exhausted, her face pale and drawn. Her clothes, once likely simple and practical, were now torn and dirty from her journey. She looked like she hadn't had a proper meal or rest in days. And the baby was silent in her arms, its tiny face barely visible beneath the thin blanket. The rancher could feel his heart tighten at the sight. He walked over to the stove, where a kettle of water was simmering, and began to prepare a cup of tea. He had no idea what to do for the woman and her baby, but the least he could offer was warmth and a drink. The woman shifted in her seat, cradling the baby protectively as if afraid it might disappear if she let go for even a second. "I'll get you something to eat too," the rancher said, his voice softer now. He didn't want to overwhelm her, but he also knew that she needed more than just a place to sit. He was a rancher, used to the rhythm of hard work and self-sufficiency, but he had no experience with this kind of situation. His home was small and simple, and it had always been just for him. He turned back to her, watching as she gently rocked the baby in her arms, her eyes distant as if lost in thought. She was clearly exhausted, but there was something else in her expression, something that spoke of fear and sorrow. It was the look of someone who had been through something painful, something no one should have to experience. The rancher set the tea on the table in front of her and knelt down, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't want to pry, but he felt he had to ask. The silence between them had been thick, and it wasn't a silence that he was used to. "Can I ask your name?" he asked softly, trying not to make her feel uncomfortable. She looked up at him, surprised by the question. For a moment she said nothing, her eyes searching his face as if weighing whether or not to trust him. Then slowly she spoke. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice hoarse, like it hadn't been used much in recent days. "And this is my son, Ben." She gently shifted the baby in her arms so that the rancher could see the tiny face, pale and quiet, looking up at him with wide, curious eyes. It was hard to tell just how old the child was, perhaps only a few months old, but the way he lay so still, as if too weak to make a sound, made the rancher's heart ache. "Ben," the rancher repeated, his voice almost a whisper. He sat down across from Clara, unsure of what to say next. His mind raced, questions bubbling up one after another. Where had she come from? What was she running from? And why hadn't anyone else helped her? Clara took a sip of the tea, her hands trembling as she held the cup. She seemed to gather herself before speaking again. I was running away from my husband," she said, her voice quiet, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "He wasn't a good man. I couldn't stay anymore. It had gotten too dangerous. But I didn't know where to go. I thought maybe I could make it to town, but the snow, it came so quickly. I couldn't get far enough. I didn't even think about what would happen to me or Ben. I just knew I had to leave." The rancher listened closely, his heart sinking as she spoke. He had heard of situations like hers before, stories of people escaping abusive relationships, but hearing it firsthand made it real, too real. It hit him harder than he had expected. "You're safe now," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. He wasn't sure what to offer her beyond shelter, but he would do what he could. "The storm is bad and it'll be hard to get anywhere in this weather. You can stay here for as long as you need." Clara nodded, but the sorrow in her eyes didn't fade. She gazed down at her baby, her expression softening as she gently stroked his cheek. It was clear that Ben was her world. He was the reason she had left, the reason she had fought to survive. "I never meant for it to be like this," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought maybe I could find something better for us, but I didn't know what would happen. I didn't plan on being here, on finding someone like you." The rancher felt a pang of sympathy for her. He could tell she was a woman who had been through more than her fair share of hardship. And yet, there was something about her, something that spoke of strength. She had made it this far despite everything. That in itself was something to be proud of. "Don't worry about any of that now," the rancher said, trying to reassure her. "You're here and you're safe. That's all that matters right now." Clara met his gaze, her eyes full of gratitude, though still tinged with fear. She had no idea what the future would hold, but in that moment the rancher had offered her something she hadn't expected, a chance to rest, a chance to breathe. She had been running for so long, both physically and emotionally, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to let go of that fear. The rancher stood up slowly, glancing at the baby once more. He wasn't a man of many words, and he wasn't sure how to offer comfort in a situation like this. But he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let her and her child face another night in the cold. He had made his decision when he opened the door to her. "Let me get some food for you," he said. "You need to eat. You've been through enough already." Clara gave a faint nod, her eyes weary but thankful. The rancher headed to the kitchen, leaving her to rest. The storm raged outside, but inside, the warmth of the fire and the presence of another person filled the room. It was a small comfort, but it was a comfort nonetheless. As he prepared something simple to eat, the rancher couldn't help but wonder about the road that had brought Clara here. He didn't know the details, but he knew enough. She had left everything behind to protect her son. She had made a choice, one that required unimaginable courage. And now, for at least one night, she had found safety in his home. The rancher had never expected to share Christmas night with a stranger, especially not in such circumstances. But as he stood in his small kitchen, preparing food for this woman and her child, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He was doing the right thing, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel quite so alone. As the hours passed, the storm outside seemed to grow even stronger. The wind howled, rattling the windows of the rancher's home, but inside, the warmth from the fire kept the chill at bay. Clara sat near the hearth, wrapped in a blanket that the rancher had fetched for her. Her baby, Ben, slept in her arms, finally settling into a deeper, more peaceful slumber after hours of shivering. The rancher didn't speak much as he prepared the simple meal. He wasn't used to company, and he found the silence comfortable, more so than he'd ever expected with a stranger in his house. But there was something about Clara that made him feel as though he wasn't entirely alone in the world. Her quiet presence, though heavy with unspoken stories, had filled the empty spaces in the house in a way he hadn't anticipated. He glanced over at her every now and then. Clara's eyes were tired, her face still drawn with exhaustion, but there was a softness in her gaze now. She wasn't the same frightened woman who had stumbled into his barn hours earlier. There was something else in her, something more hopeful. Maybe it was the warmth of the fire, or the safety she had found, or maybe it was simply that she was finally allowing herself to rest after so much running. The rancher finished preparing the food and set the table. He had made a simple stew, something hearty and filling. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. Clara didn't seem to mind. She took a seat at the table, carefully cradling Ben in her arms, still afraid to let him go. The baby stirred slightly but stayed asleep. "Thank you," Clara said quietly as she looked at the meal in front of her. "This is more than I could have hoped for tonight." The rancher nodded. "It's not much, but it'll warm you up." They ate in silence for a while, the only sound the clink of spoons against bowls and the occasional crackle from the fire. Clara ate slowly, savoring each bite, as though the warmth of the food was as much a comfort to her soul as it was to her body. The rancher didn't mind the silence. He was used to it, but it didn't feel quite as lonely with Clara there. After a while, Clara set her bowl down and looked at him. Her expression was thoughtful, and there was a vulnerability in her eyes that she hadn't shown before. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly, her voice almost fragile. "I never thought I'd end up in a place like this. I've been running for so long, I don't know what to do anymore." The rancher looked at her, his hands still resting on the edge of the table. He wasn't sure what to say to comfort her, but he knew one thing. She didn't have to explain herself to him. He understood more than she might realize. The kind of running she spoke of, both literal and emotional, was something he knew, though not in the same way. The loneliness, the feeling of being stuck in a life you never imagined for yourself. He had been there too, just in a different form. "Sometimes, you don't know what's next," he said, his voice low and steady. "But that doesn't mean you stop moving forward. Sometimes it just takes one step, even when it feels like there's no way out." Clara met his gaze, a flicker of understanding passing between them. She nodded slowly, the weight of her circumstances still heavy on her shoulders but slightly lighter after hearing his words. There was a kind of peace in the simplicity of his statement. It wasn't a promise of an easy answer, but it was the truth. Life wasn't about having everything figured out. It was about moving forward, one step at a time. As the evening stretched on, the storm outside showed no signs of letting up. But inside the rancher's home, the atmosphere had shifted. Clara felt a sense of safety she hadn't known in a long time. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was someone who had been offered kindness, a place to rest, a chance to heal. And it was something she hadn't expected, not in 1,000 years. The rancher stood and began to clear the table. He didn't mind doing the work, it kept his hands busy, kept his mind from wandering. But it also gave him a moment to reflect on what had happened in the past few hours. He hadn't planned on taking anyone in tonight, least of all a woman and her child. But something had drawn him to them, something deep inside. And now, here they were. When he returned to the table, Clara was still sitting there, her head lowered as she stroked Ben's tiny hand. She looked so tired, so fragile, and yet in some ways stronger than he had expected. He could see the love she had for her son, the protectiveness in her every movement. Even in her exhaustion, she was focused entirely on him. "How is he?" the rancher asked, his voice soft. Clara looked up at him, a faint smile on her lips. "He's better," she said. "He was so cold earlier, but he seems to be warming up now. I think he just needs rest. We both do." The rancher nodded, his gaze lingering on the baby. "I'm sure he'll be all right. You both will be." For a moment, the two of them sat in silence again, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It wasn't awkward, nor was it filled with the tension of unspoken words. It was a peaceful quiet, the kind that settled between two people who, for whatever reason, found comfort in one another's presence. As the fire crackled in the hearth, the rancher couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. He had always prided himself on his independence. He had built his ranch from the ground up, worked the land alone for years, and found solace in the quiet of his routine. But now, with Clara and Ben there, something had shifted. He was still independent, but he wasn't alone anymore. "Do you mind if I ask you something?" Clara asked after a while, breaking the silence. The rancher looked up from where he had been tending to the fire. "Of course." Clara hesitated for a moment, her gaze dropping to the baby in her arms. "Why did you help me?" she asked quietly. "I don't know why you would offer a stranger like me a place to stay. You didn't know me." The rancher thought for a moment. "I guess I saw someone in need," he said simply. "I've been alone for a long time, and I know what it feels like to need help and not know where to turn." Clara met his gaze, her eyes searching his face. She seemed to be absorbing his words, trying to understand the unspoken meaning behind them. There was something in her eyes that softened, something that spoke of relief, as though she had been waiting for someone to see her, truly see her, for who she was, someone who was struggling just like him. "I don't think I could have made it through tonight without you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what would have happened to us." The rancher gave her a small, quiet smile. "You don't have to worry about that now. You're safe here." And for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, Clara felt like she could breathe. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And in that moment, she realized that maybe this night, the night she had feared would be the end, was actually the beginning of something new. As the first light of Christmas morning began to filter through the small windows of the rancher's home, Clara awoke to find the room still warm and peaceful. The storm outside had calmed down, the wind now a distant whisper. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, casting a soft glow over the room. The baby, Ben, was still sleeping soundly in her arms, his tiny face relaxed for the first time since Clara had found herself on this unexpected journey. She shifted slightly in the chair where she had been resting, careful not to wake Ben. Her mind was heavy, filled with thoughts of what had happened in the past 24 hours. She had never imagined this, finding safety, warmth, and shelter in the middle of nowhere with a stranger. She had been running for so long, from a life that had become too dangerous to endure, and yet here she was, sitting by a fire with a kind man who had offered her everything she needed in her time of desperation. But now, as the silence stretched between them, Clara knew something had to change. She couldn't stay here forever. She had to move on, find a new path for herself and her son. She had already caused enough trouble for this rancher. He had given her more than she could ever repay. And what was she supposed to do now? Just stay here in the quiet, accepting the kindness of a man she barely knew. As these thoughts swirled in her mind, Clara felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. She had no idea what would come next, no idea where she could go or how she would find her way. She didn't want to leave the safety of the rancher's home, but she knew it was time for her to go, to take another step forward, no matter how uncertain the road ahead might be. She gently placed Ben in his small cradle by the fire, making sure he was still warm before standing up. The room felt cold without the comforting heat of the hearth, and she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, feeling the chill of the morning air. The rancher was still asleep in the other room, his deep breath steady and calm. She hadn't heard him stir all night, and she was grateful for the quiet. Clara stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the snowy landscape that stretched out in front of her. The storm had passed, but the world outside still seemed frozen, a blank canvas waiting to be filled with whatever the future held. She could leave now, she thought. She could get up and go, take Ben and disappear into the morning mist. But where would she go? What would she do? Her chest tightened at the thought of being alone again, of wandering in the cold without a plan. The decision was harder than she had imagined. The rancher had been kind to her, offered her food, shelter, and warmth when she had nowhere else to turn. He had given her more than she had expected, and now, it seemed, she had a debt to repay, a debt she wasn't sure how to fulfill. As Clara pondered her choices, she heard the soft sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see the rancher standing in the doorway, his eyes still heavy with sleep, but alert nonetheless. His rugged face was etched with the lines of a hard life, but his expression was gentle, as it had been the night before when he had offered her shelter. "I didn't mean to wake you," Clara said quickly, her voice uncertain. "I was just thinking. I can't stay here forever." The rancher stepped into the room, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "You don't have to leave if you don't want to," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need. There's no rush." Clara looked at him, her heart heavy with gratitude and confusion. "But what about you?" she asked. "You've done so much already. I don't want to impose. I don't know what I'm supposed to do next. I can't stay here forever." The rancher stood silent for a moment, his gaze steady on hers. There was something unspoken between them, something that didn't need to be said aloud. Clara had been running from her past for so long, but now, with him, she felt like she could finally take a breath. He had offered her kindness, but that didn't mean she could take advantage of it forever. "I understand," he said softly, "but sometimes we need time. We need time to figure things out. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You've been through a lot. I'm not asking you to stay because I expect something in return. I'm offering you a place to rest, a chance to heal. If you want to leave, that's your choice. But if you need time, you have it here." Clara's throat tightened as she listened to his words. She had never expected anyone to speak to her with such understanding, such compassion. The rancher wasn't asking her to stay, nor was he pushing her to leave. He was simply offering her a space to breathe, to make her own decisions, to take whatever time she needed. "I don't know where to go," Clara said softly, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to keep going. I don't know." The rancher stepped closer, his eyes warm with empathy. "You don't have to know everything right now. Just take things one step at a time. Sometimes the road ahead isn't clear, and that's okay. You don't have to walk it alone." Clara swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that had begun to well in her eyes. She had been so afraid, so sure that she was running out of time, out of options. But in that moment, standing there in the warmth of his home, she realized something. She had time. She had a chance to heal, to start fresh, to figure out what came next. "I don't want to impose," Clara said again, her voice softer now. "But maybe I could stay for a little longer, just until I figure things out." The rancher smiled, a quiet, reassuring smile. "Of course, take all the time you need. You're not imposing. You're welcome here, Clara." Clara felt a weight lift from her chest as the words sank in. It wasn't just about staying. It was about permission to stop running, to stop carrying the burden of the past. She could take time to breathe, to make decisions that weren't driven by fear, but by hope. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that things could be different. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of gratitude. "Thank you for everything." The rancher nodded, his face sincere. "You don't need to thank me. You're safe here. That's all that matters." For the rest of the day, Clara remained in the house, quietly absorbing the peace she had been given. The rancher didn't ask anything of her. He went about his chores, working in the barn and checking on the animals, but always offering her a quiet smile when their paths crossed. Clara spent most of the day with Ben, tending to him, ensuring he was fed and comfortable. She watched the fire flicker in the hearth and listened to the sound of the wind outside, knowing that for the first time in a long while, she wasn't alone. As evening came and the sky outside turned dusky, Clara sat by the fire with Ben in her arms, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know where her life was headed, but for now she was content. For now she was safe. And that was enough. Weeks passed since that first Christmas night when Clara and her baby Ben had arrived at the rancher's home. The weather had calmed, though the winter still held its grip on the land. The snow began to melt slowly, revealing patches of brown earth beneath. But the rancher's home remained a warm refuge from the cold outside. The house had become a place of comfort for Clara, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace that was hard to describe. Each morning, Clara would wake early, as she always had, to check on Ben and make sure he was well. The baby had grown stronger, his cheeks becoming rounder with each passing day. The rancher had made sure to give Clara the space she needed to recover, never pushing her to do more than she was ready for. He respected her silence, and in turn, Clara began to trust him more, opening up a little at a time. She started to help with small chores around the house. The rancher had taught her how to care for the animals, and though she wasn't used to the rough work, she found satisfaction in it. There was something grounding about being outside, tending to the livestock, feeling the cold air on her face. It made her forget for a moment the weight of her past. But even as she settled into the daily rhythm of life at the ranch, Clara's mind often wandered to the future. She knew she couldn't stay here forever. The rancher had been kind, more than kind. He had given her shelter when she had nothing, a safe place for Ben to grow. But Clara wasn't the kind of person who could live off the charity of others forever. She had always been independent, and now, as she watched Ben grow stronger, she knew that one day she would have to leave. But where could she go? What did she want for herself and Ben? Clara had always been so focused on surviving, on just making it through each day, that she had never really thought about what came next. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about living. She spent hours in the quiet of the house, thinking. She thought about her past, about the life she had left behind. It had been a painful life, filled with memories she didn't want to revisit, but it was also a life that had shaped her into the woman she had become. That woman, strong, determined, but scarred, was who she had to embrace now. Clara didn't need to run anymore. She had a chance to start over, but she had to make the choice. The rancher seemed to sense her inner turmoil. He didn't ask her directly about what she was thinking, but his small gestures spoke volumes. He would leave extra food on the table when he saw her looking tired or deep in thought. He would make sure she had what she needed without pressing for answers. He never made her feel like a burden, and that was something Clara hadn't realized she needed so much. One afternoon, as Clara was sitting on the porch, holding Ben in her lap, the rancher came to sit beside her. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden light over the fields, and for a moment, Clara felt a calm wash over her. She looked out at the wide expanse of land, feeling a strange sense of belonging. "You've been quiet lately," the rancher said, breaking the silence in his usual calm, steady voice. Clara looked at him, unsure of how to respond. She had been quiet, but her silence wasn't one of peace. It was the kind of silence that came before a decision, a choice that had to be made. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, her voice soft. "I can't stay here forever. You've been more than kind, but I have to do something. I need to start over. I can't keep running." The rancher nodded, his expression thoughtful but not surprised. He had known this day would come, the day when Clara would have to decide what came next. "I understand," he said simply. "But you don't have to have everything figured out right now. You've come a long way already. And Ben, he's doing well. You're doing well." Clara felt a lump form in her throat as she looked down at her baby. Ben's tiny hand was wrapped around her finger, and for the first time, Clara felt like everything might be all right. She had given him a better start than she ever had, and that was enough for her. "I don't know what the next step is," Clara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully leave everything behind. I don't know if I'm strong enough." "You're stronger than you think," the rancher replied gently. "I've seen you grow, seen how you've started to build a life here, even in the short time you've been with me. You've been strong for Ben. That counts for more than you realize." Clara looked up at him, meeting his gaze. There was something in his eyes, a kind of quiet respect, that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just a woman running from her past. She was someone who had the power to choose her future. The next few days were filled with a new sense of purpose. Clara began to make plans. She spoke with the rancher about finding work nearby, about starting fresh in a town just a few miles away. She didn't know if she was ready for it yet, but it was a start. She could do this. She could make a life for herself and Ben, far away from the shadows of her past. The rancher didn't try to persuade her to stay. He gave her the space to make her decision, but he also made sure she knew that she would always have a place at the ranch if she needed it. He didn't make promises for the future. He knew that life was uncertain, and sometimes the road ahead was unclear. But he offered her something that mattered more than anything: the freedom to choose. One evening, as Clara stood in front of the fire, watching the flames dance, she realized something. She didn't need to have everything figured out. She didn't need to know exactly where she was going or what the future would hold. What mattered was that she was moving forward. She had survived, she had fought, and now she had the opportunity to create something new. The journey wouldn't be easy, but she had already taken the hardest step by leaving the past behind. And now, with Ben by her side and the rancher's quiet support, Clara knew she could take the next step too. "I'll leave soon," she said one evening, sitting at the table with the rancher. "But I'm not running anymore. I'm starting over. I'm going to find a way for Ben and me to live the life we deserve." The rancher smiled, the same quiet smile he always had. "I know you will, and I'll be here if you ever need help." As the days turned into weeks, Clara continued to rebuild her life bit by bit. It wasn't perfect, and there were days when the fear of the unknown crept back in. But every day she grew stronger. She learned how to let go of the past, piece by piece, and embrace the future, no matter how uncertain it seemed. And with each small step forward, Clara realized that Christmas night, when she had found herself on the doorstep of the rancher's home, was the moment that had changed everything. It was the moment that had given her a second chance. Now, as she held Ben in her arms, watching him grow stronger each day, Clara knew that she was no longer alone. She had found something more than just safety. She had found the courage to begin again.